Hello and welcome to the very last lecture of the semester. So in today's class, we're going to be talking about implementing strategy, specifically looking at organizational architecture, so things like firm structure, culture, and these sorts of things. Before we get into lecture though, a few housekeeping things, the very last housekeeping things of the semester. As a reminder, quiz 13 is going to be due on April 26th. Quiz 14, which is on this lecture, is going to be due May 3rd. This is the last lecture of the semester. I am going to be available to discuss the cases. If you're planning on resubmitting them, I will be available to discuss those with you through the due date. Current events, as I've mentioned a few times now, because of just my delay on keeping on tabs with this, I've decided that you have until April 30th to submit your current event and write-up. So you can submit both the recording and the write-up until April 30th. If you missed your presentation, again, I'll accept it through the 30th. For case 3, what we're going to do with that, as we discussed the last couple of lectures, is you can resubmit your case 2 or case 1 for a new grade for that. And so your new grade will, if it goes up, will improve your grade. And as I've said, if the resubmissions for some strange reason lower your grade, I'll take the highest grade. And those are going to be due on April 30th as well at 5 p.m. So Wednesday, I think the last day of class. Exam 3, so if you're happy with your scores for Exam 1 and Exam 2, there's no reason to take Exam 3. As I mentioned in the syllabus at the beginning of the semester, I'm going to drop your lowest exam grade. So Exam 3, if there's a grade that you're hoping you can do a little bit better on, you can take it. It's going to be the exact same format as the last 2 exams, except it's going to include some multiple choice questions from the entire semester. And my idea is to open it up May 1st through the 8th, and then that should give y'all enough time to find a good 2 hours to take the exam, and give me a couple of days to grade and enter the exams, the final grades into the system. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to post them to the student question lobby forum or email me directly. But if there's no other housekeeping things, let's get into lecture. So for today's class, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about organizational architecture and the elements of organizational architecture, and that includes organizational structure, formal and informal integrating mechanisms, structural forms. We're also going to talk about organizational controls and incentives and different methods of control. And then we'll very, very briefly talk about organizational culture before we wrap up and talk about implementing strategy through organizational architecture. So let's get into organizational architecture. We can define organizational architecture as a firm's organizational arrangements, the formal and informal flows of information, and that these flows of information affect the firm or management's ability to identify and coordinate responses to threats and opportunities. So the key here is to match the degree or fit between the strategy that's being implemented and the structure influence, and then the structure will influence the firm's ability to earn above average returns. So all firms are affected by organizational architecture, and all firms have some form of architecture. There is a structure and culture that is in place in every organization. The difference, though, is whether or not the architecture is intentional or not, whether the way in which the organization is designed and structured has been planned or has developed haphazardly. And there's an interesting point that there's no single architecture that's inherently superior to others. That whether you're a flat organization or a tall organization, whether you have strong culture or weak culture, it doesn't seem that absent any other information that any single architecture is superior to others. However, there is a strong body of research that would suggest that the match between form and function is important. So the problem is not necessarily that one organizational architecture is better or worse than another. It's that an organizational architecture is better or worse given the context and goals of an organization. That being said, the one thing that does seem to be true, though, is that the simpler the organizational architecture, the more effective and efficient it tends to be. So organizational architecture that are overly complex tend to cause more problems, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit. But there may be instances in which you need a very complex organizational architecture given the complexities of what you're trying to address. In that case, you wouldn't say it's overly complicated or overly structured. You would say that it's structured sufficiently enough to address the needs. So the elements of organizational architecture include organizational structure, so the location of decision making, formal divisions of the organization, and integrating mechanisms. Controls, so ways of measuring unit performance and systems to indicate how well or how poorly goals are being met. This also includes incentives, devices used to encourage desired employee behavior. Architecture also includes organizational processes, so the manner in which decisions are made and work is performed, and organizational culture, the norms and value systems shared in an organization. And all of these relate to the people, the employees of an organization, and the strategies used to recruit, compensate, motivate, and retain them. Now, the thing to keep in mind while we talk about each of these elements individually is to recognize that these all influence each other. So different processes are going to influence organizational culture. Organizational culture is going to have effects on people, and so these are all interrelated ideas. And so the one of the points to draw from this is that if you just change one element, you're unlikely to see significant changes in your organizational architecture. So if you just focus on changing the processes within your organization but do nothing to change the structure or the culture or the people of your organization, you're unlikely to see much change because the structure and culture are going to reinforce the old processes that existed. And likewise, if you have controls and incentives that are that go against the kind of culture that you're trying to build, you're unlikely to be successful. And so it's this important idea that how these things are interrelated with each other, and that if you're going to try and make changes, that you have to see the ways in which these changes are going to affect the whole system. But having said that, let's go through and talk about each of these individually. Let's start with organizational structure, which is the combination of the location of decision-making responsibility, the formal division of the organization into subunits, and the establishment of integrating mechanisms to coordinate the activities of the subunits. And so organizational structure, we can understand it as assigning employees to specific value creation tasks and roles, and specifies how these tasks and roles are to work together in a way that increases a firm's competitive advantage. So ultimately, the purpose is to coordinate and integrate efforts across a company's functions and business units. So it's thinking about the way in which we organize our organization, so putting different people in different places in order for those individuals to complete various tasks along the value chain. There are three dimensions of organizational structure, or three axes that we can think about. The first are vertical differentiation, so the location of decision-making responsibilities within an organization. And so this can be centralized or decentralized. So, does information flow to a central decision-making or are multiple flows of information and multiple sources of decision making. The number of layers in a hierarchy, whether to organize a structure as tall or flat. There's also horizontal differentiation, so the formal division of organization into subunits. So how much division do you create amongst the different areas of activity? So how integrated is marketing with production? How integrated is research and development with sales? And with multi-divisional units or diversified businesses, how much is the concrete division integrated with the construction equipment division? So the horizontal differentiation would be looking across the functional areas. Vertical would be looking up and down the vertical areas or the value areas. And then finally, integrating mechanisms. So what are the processes and procedures used for coordinating subunits? So how does, given that you have differentiation across the vertical and horizontal, how are these tied together? And these are the integrating mechanisms. When we have centralization and decentralization, and again, it's not that centralization or decentralization is inherently better or worse in a generic context. It's the context and the strategy you're pursuing that dictates which is better or worse. And so, when we're talking about these, when we talk about cost of centralization or cost of decentralization or benefits, they become clear when you put them in a context. When we're talking about vertical differentiation, it determines where in the hierarchy the decision-making power is concentrated. So the centralization structures in which the decision-making authority is concentrated at a high level in the management hierarchy. Conversely, decentralization are structures in which the decision-making authority is distributed to lower-level managers or other employees. And organizations can become so decentralized in situations in which you have autonomous subunits. And these are subunits that have resources and decision-making power to operate on day-to-day basis. So you may have a unit that is given the capacity to make decisions without having to appeal to a higher level in the hierarchy of the organization. And this, we see this a lot when there are decisions that have to be made very quickly. So, for example, if you look at a job, where there's things can move very quickly and decisions have to be made. So the military, for example, that units that are out on patrol, have a great deal of authority to make decisions without having to appeal to authority. Now, granted, they're not given carte blanche, although in some instances they may be. There are some decisions in which they typically have to report back in order to make a decision. But it makes sense that a military unit on patrol, if they had to ask for permission or ask what to do for every decision that they had to make, it would be very difficult for them to make any progress. Similarly, we'll see it with things like in mines and natural resource extraction, where things that if things go awry, decisions have to be made very quickly, and so there's a benefit of having these autonomous subunits. And it's also helpful in situations in which you have a division or a unit that is doing something that's quite different or quite distinct from the rest of the firm, and so. You can think about Google's Alphabet. That Google's Alphabet, while it's part of the Google company, largely function on its own, in part because what it's doing is very different from the rest of the firm. But there's benefit in having Alphabet as part of Google's portfolio. So the arguments for centralization or decentralization, and we've kind of touched on these a little bit, but for centralization, one of the big benefits is that it allows for easier coordination of organizational activities. And so if there's a crisis that occurs, one of the things that we'll often hear is that employees are directed to are told to direct any inquiries from the media and the public to the public information officer. And the reason for that is to allow for this coordination, to make sure that there's one message that's being sent, or there's one idea that's being transmitted. The other benefit of centralization is that decisions fit the organization's broad objectives. That if decisions are made centrally, you're unlikely to have decisions in one unit that have a negative effect on another unit, because at the higher levels, you're able to see how the different parts fit together. And sometimes the lower levels may not see how their activities are related to other activities, and so you can run into instances in which you have a division that undercuts the efforts of another division. It permits strong leadership and authority that is focused on one person or group, and this can allow for speedy decision making and concerted response. We see this a lot during emergency type situations in which decision making is centralized to a strong authority figure. And part of that is because in some of these situations, what to do can be quite ambiguous. It's unclear what the right thing to do. And sometimes, as we've talked about with decision making, that when you have too many decisions or there's too much information, that you can run into the problem of information overload. And so by centralizing it, what you do is you create a situation in which you have a strong figure who's making the decision, right or wrong. This is what we're going to do, and everyone within the organization doesn't have to question, is this what we should be doing? Is this the right thing to do? They can do it, and that leads to much higher levels of efficiency. It can also lead an organization to go down the wrong path more quickly. Part of it is balancing with decentralization, because decentralization, it can reduce managerial information overload. So, if a lot of the mundane or smaller decisions are being made at lower levels, that frees senior level managers from having to make those kinds of decisions, which put a strain on their cognitive load, making it more difficult for them to see the bigger picture. We also know, from some of the things that we've talked about this semester, that when individuals are given autonomy, that autonomy leads to higher levels of motivation. And when people make autonomous decisions that they feel were their decision, that they're more likely to take responsibility for those decisions because they were their decisions. And so you can think within an organization, many of you who have had jobs and you've had a boss who micromanaged you, that was incredibly demotivating to have a manager that micromanaged, and it made it very difficult to say when something went wrong or something went right that was because of your actions. Decentralization also promotes flexibility and reduces bureaucratic costs, and it allows for on-the-spot decisions, and handoffs are not needed. So we see this a lot, in highly dynamic situations in which decisions have to be made quickly, and the context is changing rapidly. And so it's interesting or it's not interesting, but it shouldn't then come as a surprise that in the high-tech industry, which tends to be incredibly dynamic and changing at an incredibly fast pace, that high-tech firms tend to be more decentralized than traditional manufacturing. The other nice thing about decentralization is that you need fewer managers to oversee the activities of employees. And so one of the things that can happen with a highly centralized organization is you have administrative bloating. So you have administrators whose sole job is to coordinate employees when those employees could be making decisions on their own. And so one of the things that's very interesting to think about, or a question to ask, or a question that I often ask myself, is an organization like universities, which are highly centralized as well as being highly decentralized at the same time. So individual faculty have an incredible amount of autonomy. They choose what they research, they choose the journals that they publish in, They choose what they teach in their classes. There's almost, well, there's not almost, there is for all intensive purposes, almost zero oversight over what's taught in individual classes. However, universities have massive administrative, the huge, if you look at the levels of hierarchy within a university, it's quite astounding. And so there's this interesting puzzle of how you have an organization or a whole group of organizations that are both highly centralized and decentralized. And maybe this can explain some of the challenges and inefficiencies that exist in universities. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to this puzzle. What is the problem? Is it that we need to have more centralization of individual faculty? That probably doesn't seem like a great idea. But then, do we decentralize university decision making with such a large, complex institution? And so I'm not sure. I wonder if it's the unique situation that the university is in. I think it would be interesting to see a situation in which there's low centralization and also low decentralization. What an example of that might be. So if you've got that, feel free to post that on the student question lobby forum and maybe get some extra credit points there. Visually, we can think about tall hierarchies and flat hierarchies like this. So tall hierarchies have many layers of narrow spans of control. Flat hierarchies have few layers and wide spans of control. And so tall organizations, one of the issues that they face is communication problems. So there's a delay in decision of top managers to reach lower level managers' employees. That there's a delay in top management to learn how well the actions worked. There's also distortions of commands and orders as they are transmitted up and down the hierarchy. And this causes managers at different levels to interpret what's happening in their own unique way. So with very tall organizations, you can get a game of telephone that starts to emerge. And tall organizations usually indicate an organization is employing too many expensive managers. And so if you have many managers who each of whom only oversee a very narrow area of activity, you're paying someone, particularly at the higher levels, a large amount of money for something that probably could be consolidated. And this is the delayering process, or the process of reducing the number of layers in a hierarchy. So the formal integrating mechanisms, so there's direct contact. So managers from different areas work together to solve mutual problems face to face. We see this very often. And this is the kind of de facto integrating mechanism in small organizations. And there are situations in which managers may have different views about what must be done. And if the managers have equal authority, that's a situation in which the CEO needs to step in and make a decision. Now, as organizations grow and it becomes more and more difficult for managers to directly, either formally or informally, interact with each other, you may have liaison roles, or employees who are responsible for coordinating across the organization. And the coordination is part of the liaison's full-time job. And they provide a way of transmitting information across the organization. And this is particularly important in large organizations. And again, we see this at here at Appalachian State. So every department or every college at the university has an IT person, and then that IT person coordinates with the IT at the university level. And the idea then is that rather than each college developing its own IT separate from each other, there's some oversight, but that the IT person in each college is then able to support that college and lay out the IT specific opportunities and context for each department. And again, this can be incredibly important because I might have a very good relationship with Tom, the IT person in the business college, but would have no way of knowing who oversees the use of in classroom recording. So rather than having a person at the university who's responsible for classroom technology, you have a number of people in each college that who are responsible, and this is particularly relevant when the university is rolling out new technology initiatives or new programs. That way there's someone who's part of the local team that can coordinate, that can help spread the message across. Another integrating mechanism are teams, and this is where there's managers from relevant areas are assigned to a team to solve a shared problem, and then the team members are responsible for reporting back to their subunits. And so I'm sure many of you have seen this or experienced this, and the way in which teams can help integrate information across. The idea is that in general, the greater the need for coordination between areas, the more complex the formal integrating mechanisms need to be. And so if you have two separate units that are working on a very complex and tricky project that needs a high level of coordination, that you're going to have more complex and formal coordinating mechanisms. So or integrating mechanisms. So you can think about a company that's about to launch a new product. It's a very technical product, but is potential to be quite profitable. That the marketing and sales is going to be having conversations with the research and development and production folks on a regular basis. So that way the research and sales folks know exactly when the product's going to hit the shelves. They know all of its features. They know its the target, what it can do. And then during the research and development and production, the marketing folks can tell production how many units are we going to need, what's the best month for this product to be launched, and so again, the more that these separate units need to coordinate, the more complex. So we're going to have more meetings, more liaison roles, more formal communication between these two groups. And so graphically, we can think about it this way. Having two axes, the need for coordination, and then the integrating mechanisms from simple to complex. So the more complex and the higher need for coordination, you'll have matrix structures and teams, at lower levels of need for coordination, that's centralization. So generally, and we'll talk about these different organizational structures here in a bit, but we can see that the matrix structures and the teams, those tend to be in highly dynamic, highly complex and tightly, need for coordination, high-tech firms, whereas lower complexity requires less coordination, and so you're going to have these other lower integrating mechanisms. There are also informal integrating mechanisms. Not only are these formal mechanisms that exist, but there's also, in an attempt to alleviate or avoid the problems associated with formal integrating mechanisms, firms with a high need for integration have increasingly been experimenting with what we call knowledge networks. And knowledge networks are a network for transmitting information based on informal contacts between managers on distributed information systems. The strength of this is that it can be used as a non-bureaucratic conduit for knowledge flows. But the important thing is to exist managers at different locations within the organization must be linked to each other at least indirectly. And so, as visually, we can think about this, using a network map. So, information that person B has can be accessed to person E through employees C and D. And so, in this way, person E doesn't necessarily have to know person B, but they have to know person D, who knows person C. And similarly, person A doesn't have to know person B as long as both of them know person C. And there's a way in which information, can be collected by person C so that it can be shared by person A and B when the need arises. However, person G, or employee G, doesn't have access to any information. And so their ability to leverage a knowledge network is going to be quite limited. The idea, there's a lot of interesting work that exists on knowledge networks and how they work. It's a specialty within management research, looking at knowledge networks, and so there's all sorts of very interesting, sometimes counterintuitive things that we find out. For example, one of the things that we know is that innovative ideas tend to come when you have networks that span large spaces of individuals who are not connected to each other. So the likelihood that a new idea could come from person C through the combination of knowledge of A and B is lower than the level of innovation that you would expect from combining the knowledge of person B and person E through person either C or D. And so those are the what we call brokers, knowledge brokers, so individuals that sit between two unconnected sets of ideas tend to be in a position to develop the most innovative ideas. And so one of the interesting things to think about when you are trying to encourage or support or develop your knowledge network is that if there are groups that can benefit from creativity and innovation and new ideas, establishing knowledge networks that span across diverse areas can often lead to some very interesting opportunities. However, what we tend to see happen is that individuals, human beings, like to spend time and socialize with people that are like them. And we tend to avoid, on average, people that are unlike us. And so this can lead to some challenges in trying to develop this coordination across different areas. But as an example, one of the ways in which knowledge networks have been used quite effectively is when you have different geographical divisions. So you'll have a North American division and a South American division, setting up systems so that information can be transmitted between these two groups, the North American division and the South American division, because interesting ideas that emerge from each of these individual places may have value in the other, but most importantly, they in combination may lead to new innovative designs that create more value. So let's talk about structural forms. So structural forms as the next part of organizational architecture. So the idea is that as firms take advantage of opportunities, value chain management problems also increase. So the range of value chain activities expand, as well as the level of expertise required. And so you can think about the growth of a small business into a regional business, into a national business, into a multinational business. So a company like Walmart, that when Walmart was simply the general store in Arkansas, that the level of specialization needed in marketing is much lower than the level of specialization that's needed for Walmart today. Similarly for supply chain and logistics and human resources. So as the organization grows, the ability or the capacity for any one individual to oversee the growing areas also becomes more difficult, and then the specialization within each functional area also increases. And so this requires firms to alter their structural form in order to better align resources with opportunities. And so it's an important point to remember about structure, though, that no one structure is best for all organizations. The choice of structure should support the strategic goals, and that structure will change as the strategy of the organization changes. So let's look at some different kinds of organizational structures, and we can start to understand why structures for one context may be ineffective in another context. So if we start with the kind of functional structure, the standard structure that we have in our heads, and these are the structures that are organized along divisions of labor within the firm. So different functions focusing on different tasks. R&D function, marketing function, sales, and so on. And then you have a top manager, such as a CEO or a small top manager, that oversees each of these functions. And that this causes functional area managers to focus on local versus overall company strategy issues. Most signal businesses of any scale are organized along these functional lines, and it supports implementing business level strategies and some corporate level strategies with low levels of diversification. And so, most org charts are structured in this way, in which you have a CEO who oversees a number of different functional areas, and then each of those functional areas focus on their tasks. The challenge is that that there can be little integration across the functional areas. Naturally on its own. It can result in situations in which you have different hierarchy or different fiefdoms or kingdoms that can fight with each other, particularly when resources start to become constrained. And it also really leaves the CEO or the top manager to do all of the integrating across the functional areas. The benefit of it is it's pretty simple. That everyone knows what their responsibility is. They know what are the things that they have to keep track of and are responsible for. And so if designed properly, can make sure that all the important areas are covered. However, as firms expand, and they divide into additional divisions, each of which is responsible for a distinct business area, you may set up a structure in which you have, a similar functional structure set up for each of the divisions. So rather than having, rather than having marketing for the entire organization, you have marketing for the airplane division, you have a separate marketing department for the railroad division, et cetera, et cetera. And this allows for a company to grow and diversify while reducing coordination and control problems. So that the airplane division can do what it needs to do, the railroad division can do what it needs to do. And it uses self-contained divisions that has a separate corporate headquarters and staff. And this is the most common form of diversified company. And the diversified strategy requires firms to change from functional structure to a multi-divisional structure. And the level of diversification creates the need for implementing a unique form of the multi-divisional structure. And so interestingly enough, the first multi-divisional corporations that emerged were the railroad companies. The transcontinental railroad companies in the United States. And part of the reason for this is that you started to have, as the railroads expanded, crossing a larger and larger geographic distance, the ability to have centralized decision making became more and more costly. And so what the transcontinental railroad companies had to do was they had to recognize that they needed to break out and have these separate, semi-autonomously functioning units that could manage problems, across these vastly diversified spaces. So it's an interesting example of where function, so what the company was trying to do, dictated the form of the organization. That the architecture of the centralized functional decision making no longer was appropriate, and so alternative forms had to be formed. So visually, we can see that you have multiple divisions, and then each division has its own functional areas, and that each of the divisions are then overseen by a head office. Now, an interesting structure that can emerge are these matrix structures. And these are ways in which you have value chain activities that are grouped in two ways. So activities are grouped vertically by function, so that there's a familiar differentiation of task into functional areas under a product or project boss. But then superimposed upon this is a vertical pattern, is a horizontal pattern based on grouping of product or projects under a functional boss. And this tends to exist in high-tech firms, in which it's rapidly changing environments, and so you need this high level of coordination in order to make decisions. And so visually, we see it this way. You have different product development teams that each have their own management and direction, and but each of those product teams also respond to the research and development, manufacturing, marketing, and sales. And so you have a development team that is nested across the different units, and then you'll have different individual actors from each of those teams. And you may have a situation in which one functional area is not part of the matrix, that they're not perhaps needed in that matrix. So the next thing to talk about are strategic control systems. And so these are the mechanisms that allow managers to monitor and evaluate whether the business model is working as intended, how their business model could be improved upon. They include controls that regulate the activity of individuals and units so that they are consistent with the goals and standards of the organization. And the goal being a desired future state that an organization attempts to realize, a standard being a performance requirement that the organization is meant to attain on an ongoing basis. The basic structure of competitive advantage, of having controls is that, systems of control allow for efficiency. So if you have effective controls, organizations tend to be highly efficient. We can think about even at a small level. So one of the areas of waste in restaurants is food scraps, and so what tends to happen is that restaurants, kitchens that don't have strict controls about how to cut meat, how to prepare meat, that often they have high levels of waste, because you'll have these little bits of meat that aren't large enough to sell that end up getting thrown out. So control is an important way of increasing efficiency. It's also an important way of maintaining quality. So having control systems that make sure, we see this, one of the reasons why McDonald's is able to produce such large volumes of, you can say questionable quality, but quality, quality food that's good enough for many people to eat, is because they have very tight control systems. Innovation and control, so having systems that allow you to identify new opportunities or new ways of combining things. So when is something going really well that's unexpected? And then response to customers. So having systems in place that allow you to know, how well are we satisfying customers, can be an important tool. And we see some companies increasingly now with different modes of interacting with customers. Many different companies are trying out new systems of control to improve responsiveness to customers. So the generic control system, the way that this works is that you establish goals and standards, that you have some measurement, some way of measuring performance. You compare the performance against the goals and the standards. The difference between the performance and the goals and the standards leads you to take corrective action, which then feeds into the established goals and standards, or the performance meets or exceeds the goal standards, so that provides reinforcement, which then reinforces the goals and standards. So it's a feedback loop that occurs. Some of the methods of control, there's personal control, so control by personal contact and with direct supervision of subordinates. So this happens often in situations in which there's the task of the employees is incredibly complex and incredibly difficult, and so in order to make sure that things are being done, having that kind of direct supervision can be important. However, when there's a bit more clarity about what employees should be doing, then the controls can be written down. They can be part of the standard operating procedures. And then output controls, these are the goals that are set for units or individuals to achieve, and they monitor their performance against those goals. And then market controls, so regulating the behavior of individuals and units within an enterprise by setting up internal markets for some valuable resource, such as capital. So this is the idea that the division that is meeting their goals the best, we're going to give them more resources so that they can continue growing and accelerating. The units that are not performing as well, we're going to cut their resources because they're not performing as well as they should be. And I think this is, it is an interesting idea. I think in a certain context, it may prove to be quite helpful. As we've talked about, markets are an incredibly powerful tool. But as we'll talk a little bit more here in a second, that sometimes this can be problematic. And this can be particularly problematic in situations in which, if you start to cut a unit, the resources that a unit has, so that they can no longer achieve the goals and expectations that they need to make in order to improve, you're setting up divisions for failure, setting up units for failure. And while perhaps not a business example, but an organizational example, is that this model of market control is often used in public education settings. Schools that have meet certain goals of student testing scores are allocated more resources. Schools that don't achieve those goals, those resources are cut. The idea being that we need to put resources where they're most efficiently used. Well, the problem with that is that if you continue to cut funding and resources for schools that struggle to meet standards, you're going to make it even more and more difficult for them to reach those standards, and may find yourself in a point where they are no longer, even with the most innovative and motivated employees, teachers, to ever meet those goals and standards. So it's important to recognize that, and it's also important to recognize the reason why certain divisions are not reaching their goals. So if there's some systemic issue that may be inhibiting them, and that becomes particularly true when we talk about incentive controls. So incentives, devices used to encourage and reward appropriate employee behavior. When tied to team performance, it can have the added benefit of fostering a degree of peer control, and peer control being pressure employees exert on others to perform. The peer evaluations in this class is an example of trying to institute peer control, so that because that it's a group grade, that you have a reason to encourage your other group members to work on the project. However, there's limits to that. There's limits to what that can actually do, and you get free rider problems, which is why we have the individual peer evaluations to address those free riders. Incentive controls are most useful when the tasks are routine and constraining factor is effort to performance. It's less effective when creativity is the constraining factor. And if miscalibrated, it can lead to unethical behavior and unintended consequences. So this is the issue with pay for performance, as we've talked a little bit about throughout this semester, that the very interesting thing is human beings can be incredibly motivated by extrinsic rewards and threats. However, that extreme motivation also has some interesting effects on how we see things. That the greater the external motivation, so the greater the threat or the greater the external reward is, the more likely we are to focus our vision solely on the task and ignore any alternative information. So thinking outside of the box becomes more difficult. Additionally, it increases the level of anxiety. So I know that if half of my salary comes from sales commission, and I am really struggling to make ends meet, that there's a big sale, a big opportunity for a sale, I may engage in some behavior that is unethical or questionable, but gets me the sale. And so that's an important thing to consider. The other thing that's really interesting that some folks that I may have mentioned in a previous lecture is that there is some growing concern in the management scholarship that we are driving employees to higher levels of anxiety through these incentive controls. So do we need to rethink these sorts of things? And what does that mean moving forward? The problem, though, is the kind of flat salary. Everybody gets the same salary. Doesn't seem fair either. So how do we balance these two things? So let's talk about organizational culture here. And these are the specific collection of values and norms shared by people and groups in an organization. So values are the ideas or shared assumptions about what a group believes to be good, right, and desirable. The norms are the social rules and guidelines that prescribe the appropriate behavior in a particular situation. And we could have a whole lecture on organizational culture, and it's a fascinating topic, in part because culture can exert a profound influence on the way people behave in an organization. It affects how decisions are made. It affects what the things the organization does and doesn't pay attention to, and what is or isn't an opportunity or a threat. So we've talked, we talked at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about heuristics and biases and looking at a hamburger and different ways of seeing a hamburger. Well, a lot of the factors that influence how we see that hamburger are the culture, and we know that organizations have their own unique and distinct cultures, as any group of people would have. And so culture can be an incredibly powerful tool, and as a means of control. The means of control through socialization, so how people learn the organizational culture. And it really begins with the recruitment and hiring process. So this interesting thing about who you choose to attract and hire, recruit to work at your organization can have a significant effect on your organizational culture. So if you hire a number of individuals who don't consider, or if you hire someone who doesn't think safety is very important, doesn't pay much attention to safety, is always kind of going around safety rules, that the more people that you hire that have that orientation, the less likely that safety will be an important feature of your organization's culture. And so who you hire has important effects, and this is also true of ethics. So if you hire folks, particularly at higher levels within the organization, who don't value ethics, that's likely to have negative effects on the organizational ethics through culture. So some of the tools of culture, places where the created and the material interact. So it's a bit of an abstract idea, but we can think about structures, stories, symbols, and language. So these are all the ways in which culture can be adapted and changed and modified What's the story that the CEO tells at the annual meeting? What are the symbols that are used throughout the organization? How do we talk about certain things? So proposing a creative idea at a company where everyone dresses conservatively, that's probably going to be difficult, because the conservative dress is both an expression of and a reinforcement of the conservative culture of the organization. The other question to ask, though, about organizational culture, that we used to talk a lot more about organizational culture, and it seemed to be that it was the panacea for high-performing firms, because what we found was that all high-performing firms had very positive cultures. And so it kind of created this idea, the correlation between high-performing firms and positive culture, that the way to become a high-performing firm was to have a positive culture. And a lot of efforts were made by a number of companies and researchers to look into this question, or look into this issue. And what started to emerge was that maybe it's not that high-performing firms, that positive culture leads to high performance, but maybe it's high performance leads to positive culture. And that this idea that when things are going well, employees are happy, when everyone's getting raises and bonuses and expanding, it's really easy to be cooperative and friendly. But when people are getting fired, salaries are being cut, folks are having to work longer for the same amount of pay, that's when morale tends to go down. So it raises this interesting question: do great companies have great cultures, or do great cultures make great companies? And the truth is that it's likely to be both. The other problem is that culture can't be manufactured. That you can't, a CEO just can't come in and say, we're going to have a positive culture. That these things are quite nebulous. They have an emergence type property, which means that they tend to only exist as people come together, and the way that they come together has unique ways of affecting culture. So it's not the aggregate, it's not the simple sum of each individual employee, that there's something that happens when the group comes together that creates this culture. So culture is an incredibly powerful tool. It can have significant effects on a firm's performance. But the challenge is it's not particularly clear how you control it. This other question is organizational culture top down or bottom up? It's a little bit of both. And so what I would say is that it's an important thing to consider. It's an important thing to spend time on, but it can't be the dominant focus of your organization or your decision making as a manager. We hear this a lot. Particularly now, that having a great logo and a great motto, a great slogan, and great PR material doesn't inherently make you a great company. But all great companies tend to have great logos, but again, the question is Nike's logo so powerful because Nike is such a successful company, or is Nike such a successful company because it has a powerful logo? And the truth is, it's a little bit of both. So just briefly, let's talk about integration and control systems. So when there's low integration, bureaucratic controls in the form of budgets used to allocate financial resources to each functional area, and control spending by the functions, and then the output controls are then used to assess how well a function is performing. In situations in which there's high levels of integration, you're going to also have the bureaucratic controls for financial budgeting, and the output controls will be used to different functions and also the cross-functional product development teams. So let's talk about implementing strategy through organizational architecture here. So while no single architecture is perfect in all situations, the simplest organizational structure that will do the job is the best one. What makes organization structure good are the problems it does not create. The simpler the structure, the less that can go wrong. Above all, the architect of an organization needs to keep in mind the purpose of the structure he is designing. And that's from Peter Drucker, one of the more famous business scholars and consultants. So, the need for integrating between org function will depend upon the business level strategy of the firm and the nature of the environment in which it competes. And so we might think of a situation in which there's high environmental change and differentiation through innovation. So if there's little environmental change and little differentiation through innovation, then functional strategies with low interaction, direct contact, and with liaison roles, that may be the most effective strategy. It's the simplest, so there's the less that needs to be done. But in highly complex situations with lots of change, you may need something more complicated like a matrix structure. So the need for integration between functions is greater for firms that are competing through product development and innovation. And in such organizations, there's an ongoing need to coordinate the R&D, production, marketing functions in the firm to ensure that new products are developed in a timely manner, that they can be efficiently produced and delivered, and that they match consumer demands. So that's it for this semester. I thank you all very much for joining me this semester. It's been an interesting journey for sure. I hope you've learned some things that will be helpful. So if you're not planning on taking the exam or resubmitting the case, and you've already completed your quizzes, have a wonderful summer break. For those of you that are going to be resubmitting your cases, remember those are due April 30th. And for those of you taking the third exam, that'll open up on May 1st and will close on May 8th. If anyone wants to chat about their case resubmission or the exam, please let me know. If not, we will see you guys some other time. All right, thank you very much.